Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on refractory periods, absolute refractory periods and relative refractory periods, and also effective refractory periods and functional refractory periods. Are they different? If so, what is the difference? And why don't we hear more about effective and functional refractory periods? I'm Dr. Jerry Jones. I'm the CEO and Chief Instructor at Medicus of Houston in Houston, Texas. I also teach my classes in London, United Kingdom. I have no disclosures. Okay, we're going to begin with the absolute refractory period. Now, this is something that I think most of you are familiar with. You know that there is no possibility of a depolarization occurring during the absolute refractory period. All sodium channels are closed. And this is a protective mechanism by the heart to prevent the heart from falling prey to a very, very, very rapid tachycardia. Let's take a look at a QRS complex and its repolarization. Now, while we know exactly where the absolute refractory period begins, we're not too sure where it ends. We know that it begins at the onset of the QRS complex, or the onset of the action potential. In this case, it's the beginning of this R wave, but it could be a Q wave or a QS wave. It just depends on which is the first deflection of the QRS complex. Now, we know exactly where it begins. It begins right there, but where it ends is not so certain. We feel it's somewhere around the middle. Sometimes people say the slight downslope of the T wave, but we don't know for sure. We can accurately pinpoint the onset of the absolute refractory period on any ECG, but we really can't pinpoint its end. We think of the absolute refractory period in terms of duration. Here we see it's measured in milliseconds. In actuality, the heart sees it a bit differently. The heart sees it in terms of voltage. Now, by minus 60 millivolts, if an action potential hasn't occurred by then, it's not going to, because all the sodium channels will have been opened and then closed. Now, if we go on around this action potential, we finish off phase 0, then phase 1, phase 2, we come down to phase 3. You see the horizontal line intersecting phase 3 in the downslope of that action potential. That represents about the middle of the T wave. Phase 3 represents the T wave. It doesn't look like one, I know, but it does represent the T wave. And so this is intersecting the T wave at about its middle, and that's what we normally consider to be the end of the absolute refractory period. But we don't know that for sure. Okay, you see the absolute refractory period measured in millivolts and in milliseconds. But measuring it in milliseconds as a duration is how most of us measure the absolute refractory period. Now, we come to the relative refractory period, which is quite different. During the relative refractory period, conduction is possible beginning with extra strong impulses. Later on, in the latter part of the relative refractory period, it begins to respond to normal impulses as well. Now, again, looking at our QRS complex and polarization, we see that we're not too sure about the onset of the relative refractory period because it simply follows the termination of the absolute refractory period. Obviously, since we don't know for sure where the absolute refractory period ends, we don't know for sure where the relative refractory period begins. It ends generally at the point at which the T wave returns to the baseline, whether it's upright or inverted. the relative refractory period ends at the point where the T wave returns to the baseline. And that point sometimes is not very clear either. But the thing we know about the relative refractory period is that conduction can occur during the relative refractory period. It's at the earliest point, it doesn't occur unless there is an extra strong stimulus, or it will produce a QRS complex, for instance, that is aberrant, or it may have a prolonged PR interval. But towards the end, as it returns to normal, everything involving the AV node and the His-Purkinje system, the bundle branches, all that returns to normal and conduction is once again normal. So with the absolute refractory period, we know exactly where that begins. We're not too sure where it ends. With the relative refractory period, again, we're not too sure where it begins, and we sort of think that it ends when the T wave returns to the baseline. Before we go on to discuss relative and absolute refractory periods in more detail, let's understand something. First of all, we really can't see refractory periods on an ECG. We can see the origin of the absolute refractory period, but everything else remains invisible to us. We can only surmise where the refractory periods start or end by how depolarization looks on an ECG. For instance, an early P wave that failed to conduct to the ventricles ran into an absolute refractory period after leaving the atrium. Or an early P wave that conducted to the ventricles, but with some degree of aberrancy, was conducted through the ventricles during the early relative refractory period at some point after leaving the atrium. And an early P wave that conducted with a normal appearing or near normal appearing QRS complex either arrived near the end or after the relative refractory period.
Absolute and relative refractory periods are descriptive terms. They are described by actions that occur on impulses produced during the action potential. These refractory periods can't be seen on the ECG, and attempts by us to measure them are always just gross approximations. Now, electrophysiologists can't see them either, but they do attempt to measure them. And by attempt, that means their measurements are not totally accurate, but they're a lot more accurate than our attempts. In the electrophysiology lab, the electrophysiologist begins by providing 8 consecutive electrical stimuli at precisely regular intervals. And this is called a train. They do this because the refractory period during an RR interval depends on the length of the previous RR interval. Now, providing the train prevents any irregularity like a sinus arrhythmia from interfering with the evaluation. If you recall, the Ashman phenomenon is based on this, and in fact, this is where we discovered the fact that an RR interval's refractory period depends on the length of the previous RR interval. Doctors Ashman and Guo discovered this. Now, after the 8th stimulus, a premature stimulus is then introduced at a precisely timed interval, and it's observed for the production of a QRS indicating conduction or no QRS indicating no conduction. Now, in order to locate the end of the absolute refractory period, the electrophysiologists, that I'll refer to as EPs, use coupling intervals. Now, a coupling interval is the interval in milliseconds between the depolarization of a chamber and the next depolarization of that same chamber. Coupling intervals involve depolarizations. We don't measure coupling intervals between T waves, for instance. The interval between 2 successive P waves is a coupling interval. The interval between 2 successive QRS complexes is a coupling interval. Now, following the train of 8 stimuli, the EP begins introducing premature stimuli and measures the coupling intervals from the last beat of the train to the premature stimulus. Now, how does the electrophysiologist measure the absolute refractory period? Well, before we get started, when the electrophysiologist is measuring the absolute refractory period, we call that the effective refractory period. They're virtually the same thing. Now, following the train of 8 stimuli, a premature stimulus is introduced. Now, the last beat of the train is labeled S1, stimulus 1, and the premature beat is labeled stimulus 2, S2. The interval S1 to S2 is the coupling interval. Now, if S2, the premature beat, does not produce a QRS complex, then it obviously appeared during the effective refractory period or absolute refractory period. So what does the EP do now? The EP makes the coupling interval longer by introducing the premature stimulus, S1, a bit later, let's say by 10 milliseconds. When a QRS complex finally appears, the end of the effective refractory period has been reached at the previous coupling interval. Remember, the effective refractory period began like the absolute refractory period. It began with the onset of the QRS of S1, and it ends with the longest coupling interval that failed to conduct. Now, the title of this slide is One Man's Absolute Refractory Period is Another Man's Relative Refractory Period. Now, let me explain that. We know where the absolute refractory period, the effective refractory period, and something we'll learn about later, the functional refractory period begin. They all begin with the onset of depolarization. What we don't know for sure is where they end. Now, changing the strength of the stimulus or the length of the coupling intervals can change where the absolute refractory period or effective refractory period ends and the relative refractory period begins. So let's say right here we have determined that the effective refractory period ends right at this point where the arrow is. And by surmising the onset of the relative refractory period, this would be approximately the onset of the relative refractory period following the absolute refractory period. But let's say we use a stronger stimulus than what we were using. And what happens then is that we find the end of the absolute refractory period or the beginning of the relative refractory period is a little bit further into what we thought was the absolute refractory period. But by increasing the stimulus, we find out that, yeah, we can produce a QRS complex here. So this is really, we're in the relative refractory period. But we discover this by increasing the stimulus. But let's say we decrease the stimulus. We make it weaker. Well, we weaken it to the extent that it has to go further into the real relative refractory period before it produces a QRS complex. So by changing the strength of the stimulus, we can alter the designation between absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. But there really is an end to the absolute refractory period. It's just that we can't locate it precisely. Now we're going to discuss measuring the effective and functional refractory periods, but before we start, I want to make something clear about these two terms. Now, we can use the terms effective refractory period and absolute refractory period interchangeably. What's the difference? The difference is that the effective refractory period is a measured duration in an EP lab, and it's a bit more precise
than just the concept of an absolute refractory period. It's actually a lab measurement, but we can use the terms interchangeably. Now, how about functional refractory period and relative refractory period? They do not measure the same things. Don't think for a moment that effective refractory period and functional refractory period are in any way similar to the relationship between the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. And let's see why. The effective refractory period approximates the absolute refractory period, as I just said. It's the coupling interval between the onset of depolarization of S1, that last stimulus, the eighth stimulus in the train, and the last stimulus that fails to produce an impulse, which would be S2. It's the coupling interval between those two stimuli in the electrophysiology lab. Okay, here we have a normal QRST complex. We can see this QRS is actually a Q and an R and an S. So we are going to be measuring from the onset of the QRS, the onset of phase 0 of the action potential, and that's right here where this vertical red line is. Now, these vertical red lines all represent stimuli that failed to conduct. Stimuli that failed to conduct. So the effective refractory period would be the duration from the onset of the QRS to that last stimulus that failed to conduct. That would define the effective refractory period, which is virtually the same as the absolute refractory period. But let's look at something else. The functional refractory period is the coupling interval from the onset of depolarization, that first vertical red line, to the first capture of the myocardium. Okay, we have these three dark blue lines here. They're dotted, indicating that the QRS that would be produced here, the result of the stimulus, is going to change gradually the further we get into the relative refractory period. The functional refractory period is going to measure from the onset of depolarization to that first stimulus that captures the myocardium, that first stimulus that produces, in this case, a QRS complex. So it will be the shortest coupling interval that produces a QRS complex. That's the functional refractory period. The effective refractory period is the longest stimulus that fails to produce a QRS complex, the longest coupling interval, I should say, that fails to produce a QRS complex. What I want you to notice is that both values actually depend on the strength of the stimulus and the length of the coupling interval. Again, you saw what happened if we were to increase or decrease the strength of the stimulus. If we increase the strength of the stimulus, it's possible that we could produce a QRS further into what we thought was the absolute refractory period. If we weaken the stimulus, we would actually be going well into the true relative refractory period before we could produce a QRS complex, before we could capture the ventricles. So you see, by changing the strength of the stimulus, it can alter our perception of where the end of the absolute or effective refractory period is and the onset of the relative refractory period. Both values, the value for the effective refractory period and the value for the functional refractory period, both values are measured from the onset of depolarization. What I want you to see here is that the functional refractory period in no way approximates the relative refractory period. The functional refractory period is that duration from the onset of the QRS
to the beginning of the relative refractory period. What we think of as the relative refractory period would begin at that point and extend forward. So the functional refractory period does not in any way approximate the duration of the relative refractory period. It just notes where the relative refractory period begins. We don't really look to see where the relative refractory period ends because we're going to have capture, we're going to have depolarization of the ventricular myocardium from that point on. So there's no reason to try to figure out where the relative refractory period ends. Now, let me go back over some of this because I don't want you getting confused here. While the absolute refractory period is approximately the same as the effective refractory period, the relative refractory period is not at all the same as the functional refractory period. The relative refractory period begins at the end of the absolute refractory period. The functional refractory period ends at the beginning of the relative refractory period. So both the effective refractory period and the functional refractory period begin with the onset of ventricular depolarization, with the onset of the QRS complex. As many of you already know, I teach courses in advanced electrocardiography, and I'm inviting you to come join us in one of our master classes. These are live 4-day courses in advanced ECG topics. They are not review courses. You will be learning new advanced information about electrocardiography. The classes are small and limited to a maximum of just 20 participants. They're casual, informal, and you can ask questions at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of a presentation to simply ask a question. There are up to 14 hours of active in-class participation by everyone. I'm a firm believer in learning by doing. And there are AMA-PRA Category 1 credits available for those completing the course. So I do invite you to come join us. Do you need to improve your ECG interpretation skills? Well, in addition to my scheduled classes, you can receive private tutoring from me online via Zoom. Visit us at https://medicusofhouston.com or contact me via email at jwjmd@medicusofhouston.com. And feel free to join my new group on Blue Sky, ECG Nerds, and subscribe to my new YouTube channels at Medicus of Houston 7184 or at ECG Prof. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I hope I see you in one of my master classes very soon. Thank you again.